Today we are diving into a proposal that has sparked intense debate across global capitals, financial institutions, and
We are facing
diplomatic
turbulent
circles.
times, but we will take
Russian
decisive
President
action to
Vladimir
stabilize
Putin
our
has
economy and
suggested using
rebuild.
frozen Russian assets to help rebuild war-torn Ukraine, and at first glance, this idea sounds surprising, even paradoxical. To understand why this proposal matters, and what it could actually mean in practice, we need to unpack the political context, the legal realities, the economic implications, and the deeper strategic motivations behind such a statement. Since the start of the war in Ukraine, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Russian state assets and central bank reserves have been frozen by Western governments. These funds are held primarily in Europe, the United States, and allied financial systems. The freezing of these assets was designed as a punishment and a pressure tool, meant to constrain Russia's ability to finance the war and stabilize its economy. Over time, however, the conversation has shifted from freezing these assets to potentially seizing them outright and redirecting them toward Ukraine's reconstruction. Ukraine's reconstruction needs are enormous. Entire cities have been damaged or destroyed, critical infrastructure has been hit, and millions of people have been displaced. Estimates for rebuilding Ukraine run into the hundreds of billions of dollars, possibly even exceeding $1 trillion over the long term. Western governments have pledged aid, but political fatigue, budget constraints, and domestic opposition have made long-term funding uncertain. This is where frozen Russian assets entered the discussion as a possible funding source. Against this backdrop, Putin's proposal appears, on the surface, to acknowledge responsibility for reconstruction. But when we look more closely, the idea is far more complex and arguably more strategic than it seems. The proposal raises fundamental questions about sovereignty, international law, accountability, and the future rules governing global finance and warfare. One of the first things to clarify is what frozen assets actually are. These are not piles of cash sitting in a vault that can be easily handed over. Most of them are central bank reserves invested in bonds, securities, and other financial instruments. They are frozen, meaning Russia cannot access or move them, but ownership has not legally changed. Turning frozen assets into reconstruction funds would require either Russia's consent or a legal mechanism allowing confiscation, both of which are controversial. From a legal standpoint, the seizure of sovereign assets sets a dangerous precedent. Many countries worry that if Western governments can seize Russian reserves today, their own assets could be vulnerable tomorrow during a future political conflict. This concern is especially strong among non-Western countries, emerging economies, and nations that already distrust the dominance of Western financial systems. Putin's proposal may be designed to exploit these fears. By suggesting that frozen assets be used for reconstruction, Putin can frame Russia as reasonable and pragmatic, while subtly shifting the responsibility onto Western governments. If the West refuses, Russia can argue that it offered a solution and that continued suffering in Ukraine is partly due to Western obstinacy. This narrative plays well not only domestically in Russia but also in parts of the global South that are skeptical of Western sanctions. At the same time, the proposal could be an attempt to regain some control over how these assets are ultimately used. If Russia agrees, even conditionally, to the use of frozen assets, it may seek to impose terms. These terms could include political concessions, recognition of territorial changes, or limits on how reconstruction funds are distributed. In that sense, the proposal could be less about rebuilding Ukraine and more about leveraging frozen assets as a bargaining chip. There is also a messaging element aimed at Western publics. As economic pressures rise and voters question the cost of supporting Ukraine, the idea of using Russian money instead of taxpayer funds can sound appealing. Putin's proposal could amplify these debates, increasing pressure on Western governments to negotiate rather than continue long-term support. From Ukraine's perspective, the proposal is deeply problematic. Accepting Russian-controlled or Russian-approved funding could undermine Ukraine's sovereignty and its narrative of victimhood and resistance. Ukraine has consistently argued that Russia should pay reparations, but through international mechanisms that do not give Moscow leverage over Ukraine's future. A deal framed on Russian terms could risk legitimizing aggression or locking in political outcomes unfavorable to Kiev. There is also the moral dimension to consider. Reparations after wars are not new, but they are typically imposed after a clear defeat or peace settlement. In this case, the war is ongoing, and Russia has not accepted responsibility for its actions in the way that international law usually requires. Using frozen assets without a broader accountability framework could allow Russia to avoid deeper consequences while appearing cooperative. Economically, the implications are significant. If frozen assets are used, whether with or without Russia's consent, global trust in reserve currencies could be shaken. Central banks around the world hold reserves in dollars, euros, and other major currencies because they are considered safe and politically neutral. If these reserves can be redirected during conflicts, countries may accelerate efforts to diversify away from Western currencies, reshaping the global financial system over time. This shift is already underway to some extent. Russia, China, and other countries have been exploring alternatives to the dollar-based system for years. Putin's proposal could be another step in highlighting the risks of relying on Western-controlled financial infrastructure. Ironically, even while suggesting the use of frozen assets, the proposal reinforces Russia's long-term narrative that the current global financial order is unfair and politicized. Another angle worth examining is domestic politics within Russia. The Kremlin needs to maintain public support for a long and costly war. By proposing to use frozen assets, Putin can argue that Russia is not financially burdening its own citizens for reconstruction, and that the West is already holding Russian money anyway. This framing can help deflect criticism and maintain the image of strategic foresight. We also need to consider whether the proposal is even realistic. Western governments are divided on how to handle frozen assets. Some support using the interest generated by the assets rather than the principal, as a compromise that avoids outright confiscation. Others argue for full seizure. Adding Russia's conditional approval into this already complex debate could make implementation even harder, not easier. There is also the issue of trust. Even if Russia were to agree to the use of frozen assets, many would question whether this agreement would be honored in good faith. Would Russia attempt to influence reconstruction priorities? Would it use funding as leverage in future negotiations? These uncertainties make policymakers cautious. In the broader geopolitical context, the proposal fits into Russia's strategy of presenting itself as open to negotiation while continuing military pressure. By floating ideas that sound constructive, Moscow can claim diplomatic initiative without necessarily changing its actions on the ground. This strategy complicates Western unity and forces Ukraine's allies to constantly respond to new narratives. For Europe, the stakes are particularly high. Many of the frozen assets are held in European financial institutions. European governments face legal challenges, political divisions, and economic risks related to any decision on these funds. Putin's proposal adds another layer of complexity, potentially deepening divisions within the European Union over how to proceed. Thanks for staying with me through this deep dive, and as always, stay curious and informed as this situation continues to evolve.